Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Strip by Sia, your podcast for strippers, sex workers, and all the fancy naked people in between. I am your host, Steph Sia, aka Kimchi on the stripper stage. I am a digital content creator, although I've been really doing such a bad job with my OnlyFans lately. I'm sorry. Life has got in the way. And I was a former sugar baby back in the day, and then I'm also a current I am a stripper. I will be stripping this week at Shaker Show Lounge. If you are local in Vancouver, I will be there, and let's chat all this week. So that is me in a nutshell. I have been doing the show for the past couple years or so. If you're new here, it's all about sex work in terms of destigmatizing the industry, really trying to provide like really holistic approach to sharing the lived experiences and stories of sex workers to humanize us, because a lot of the times we are not treated as such. So
isn't that the truth? Yeah.
It's such the truth. Like, it is really, really frustrating. So that's kind of why I started the show, and it's just been kind of going on and on and on. And I can
I feel you, girl. I do.
Well, honestly, there's so much content to like speak about, so that's why I just keep kind of rolling with it, and
Yeah.
people keep coming to me. So that's that. But everyone listening is probably like, "Who is that voice? Who's laughing? Who is that?" You may, if you've been listening for the past season and a bit, you may recognize her voice. This is Jessie Sage. I'm actually bringing her back on the show to speak about this huge topic, which is all about privilege. And you might have recognized Jessie from my sex work in the media episode, where we talk about how sex is portrayed, how sex work is portrayed, how workers are portrayed in the media, in magazines, in movies, and all the stuff. She is the host of the Peep Show podcast, also has a media company, Peep Show Magazine, Peep Show Media. Am I missing anything?
Yeah, no, Peep Show Magazine is good.
all of those things. But
yeah, and I have a new podcast on the horizon.
Yes, on the horizon. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe to that. But it's really nice, Jessie, to have you back on. Thank you again for your time today. I'm super excited to chat with you. It's very rarely that I invite people back in the show, but there have been a few people I'm like, you have to come speak. You have to come speak. And yeah, basically this topic, I tweeted something a couple of weeks ago now, was it? I think, yeah.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, something like that. I said something about like, I can't remember what he said, but it was something about like, what does privilege look like to you? And then it just kind of struck a whole conversation. And to me, in my very small amount of followers in the Twitterverse, like that went viral to me. It was like, I had like 2,000 like followers, so like it like got like retweeted a bunch of times and liked a bunch of times, and I was like, whoa, people really want to talk about this. So this is why I'm bringing Jessie on the show. We're kind of mixing things up a little bit in terms of format, which you'll hear later on the episode. But Jessie, do you want to maybe give a quick intro about like who you are first before we dive into the topic?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things that you asked about when you put up that tweet is how do you consider privilege in regards to like face out or face in? And the reason that I reached out to you is because I've been in this industry a long time, maybe 7 years, and I started doing cam work, and then I was doing phone sex, and then I did content creation. My OnlyFans is also kind of dying because I'm busy. So like I'm with you. I mean, it's not dying. I just don't have a lot of time. But yeah, and then over time I moved into full service work, and what I was interested in talking, or why I reached out to you, is because I think that those are really, really hard decisions. And I was interested in talking about this because when I moved into full service work, I'm very, very face out as Jessie Sage. And when I moved into full service work, I created a whole nother brand with a different name that's not face out. And so I consider myself, and I am like a very privileged sex worker. I'm out. People know that I do full service. Like my face is out. I write a lot. People know what I do. But those are still really complicated like questions about like how you how you talk about the work that you do, how you advertise, like whether you can get away with advertising like as yourself, or you need to create like different sorts of personas. And I think that and whether you can have your face out or not. And I think a lot of that has a lot to do with, your personal situation, whether you have kids or not, like all sorts of things. So I think that when we talk about sex work and we talk about privilege and we talk about like who can do what kind of work and how open they can be about it, it's actually not as complex. It's not as simple as like who has comes from who's white and who's not, and who comes from like socioeconomic privilege and who doesn't, and who's educated and who's not. I mean, I think those are all total factors, and the sex industry is very stratified, and we can't pretend that that's not true. But I also think that this being like a stigmatized and in many cases criminalized profession means that these questions are just more complicated than that.
Absolutely. And like I feel like a lot of people wanted to chime in on this, and like a lot of people did chime in on this
Mm-hmm.
to kind of share their experiences and then also like their own stories. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
because like it's something maybe we don't speak enough about, and it's something we don't discuss.
Yeah, and I think I was thinking about this too. I mean, part of the thing is that most of our public facing stuff is client facing, and we do like protect our stories. So
Yeah.
like, I think that a lot of the things that people see are advertising, and I think that sex workers themselves like can sometimes get caught up in that and not know what's real and what's not real, and what people's real lives look like, and how much money they're making and how successful they are, because we don't really have like a measure for that.
No, we don't. That's really an interesting point too, because then like a lot of it can sometimes be like a facade too.
Uh-huh.
Like I was like you mentioned money, and I was speaking with somebody. Who was I speaking to? I can't remember who it was recently, and we were just chatting. Oh yeah, it was my friend Luna left. We were chatting about money and how exaggerating sometimes it can
Mhm.
be, and like
Mhm.
how that can make other people feel. When people do like
Yeah.
those money flashes, or like people used to do
Right.
that a lot when I was sugaring. People used to always
Mhm.
flash all the money they made, and like all like the Louis Vuitton bags and all the stuff that they got.
Right.
And it's just like, whoa, like like when I was younger, when I was sugaring, I was like, oh my god, I'm not making money like that.
Yeah. Right, right. But then
Yeah,
you also realize like a lot of people who seem like they're making money like that are also not making money like that. And I think that a lot of people make a lot of money in the sex industry. And I think certainly you can make more money for the amount of time that you put in than in other jobs, especially in other jobs that women that are coded feminine,
yeah,
but I think that, all of that is more complicated than that. And a lot of it is posturing, and a lot of it is catering to what clients value.
right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
Do you want to speak a little about that in terms of like what clients value? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've had this conversation with a lot of other sex workers, and I think it's really interesting. So, we've talked a lot about the fact that, when you're a sex worker, a lot of your compensation, I mean, I don't know how it works for like strippers, but a lot of compensation comes in the form of gifts too,
Hmm.
and it's not just
Yeah,
straight cash, and
yeah,
especially if you do a lot of online work, like people will, wish lists are a big thing, people will
yes.
send you presents or give you things, or I joke because I joke with one of my clients because I call him the nail fairy. And every time I need a manicure or pedicure, I'm like, the nail fairy needs to leave me money for my manicure. Which is like,
Love
which
that.
I love. It's so cute because like that's his job. He needs to pay for like my manis and petties. And, um, but there's something about like those sorts of luxury items that make clients feel like they're doing something that's fun and that's
Mhm.
sexy and that like is not work. Like there's something about like the fantasy of all of this luxury that is more fun for clients than being reminded that like this is our job. And
Yeah.
so, gifting dishes that we need, or the money for the electric bill, or basic necessities, like that's not really what makes clients feel like they're this is a fun, sexy, exciting thing
Mm,
that makes it feel transactional. So I think a lot of what happens in sex work is that we need to create like a fantasy that makes it seem as if we don't need money, which means that like the gifts and the
right.
money that comes in needs to look like they're for things that are completely superfluous that we don't actually need, which is
Right.
this weird sort of
It's a bit of a
loop.
dance. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's a bit of a dance.
Interesting. Because I remember, like, when I first, okay, back to when I was sugaring again, too. Because I remember,
Mhm.
like, when I first started, like, gifts and trips and all the stuff, like, that was seen as, like, being a Splenda daddy. And, yeah, like, I remember just, like, gifts and trips and stuff like that. Like, people would see that as, like, oh, that's a Splenda
Yeah.
daddy. Like, you need to get cash. And, like, for me, sometimes, like, when I was starting out, I was like, oh, like, I actually don't mind getting gifts and stuff. And, like, it was hard for me to just ask for straight up
Mhm.
money. Um, yeah, so, like, I don't know, like, how different that is now, or if that rings true to anybody, or where they're at, or what they prioritize, but I don't know if
Right.
that, like,
Yeah.
resonates with anybody. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it's easy for me to like set my rates and be like, okay, these are my rates, but anything on top of that feels like um yeah, that it's like a dance. And actually I had this funny situation last night where a client said to me, "Oh, I think I brought you a little bit more money than like I owe you." And I was like, okay. And I don't want to be like, well, you could tip me. Like, why are like are you asking for
Yeah. Yeah.
change or like what do you need? You know? And he said, he's like, and then he stopped because he realized it was kind of a strange interaction. And he's like, wait, so do people typically tip or do they not tip? And I was like, yeah. And it was
Oh my
weird because
gosh.
I felt like suddenly I'm put in this weird position and I'm like, oh no, I really appreciate tips, but you know, I'm not offended when people don't tip because in full service, like people do tip, but a lot of times they just give you what your rate is, you know, and which I understand because rates are higher. So like it's already a chunk of change, you know, but it was weird because I didn't want to act like I was offended by the last 10 times that I didn't get a tip from him. And I'm like, you know, and so then you're
Yeah.
also dancing around like how to say, oh, I really appreciate tips, but I don't expect them. So if you'd like to give me one, go ahead. But
Yes. Because you don't want to seem like, oh my God, I'm just in
it's,
it for the money. But, like, even though we are just
yeah,
in it for the money, yes, that's
it's
a
our
big part of
job. Yeah, that's how we
it.
make our money.
You know,
Right.
like, we're not saying, do the job.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, like, on that note, like, I know that, like, another another big topic, and like some of the comps that came in was talking about like the difference in rates, and like, is that something that you think that comes with experience and versus like inexperience? Like, do you think that is a bit of
Yeah, and I also think
privilege?
it's like privilege on a lot of different things. Like I think there's geographical privilege too. Like people in New York and people in San Francisco just make more money than in other cities. And I actually when I set up my rates like have a different rate for New York, DC, Boston. You know, just because the rates are higher. So if I was to go with my like Pittsburgh rates on tour in New York, I would be hit up like a lot, but not by clients that I necessarily like. I don't, you know, it's just like it's not the standard rate in that city. So like I have to kind of adjust it to that. But I think so. So I think that in different cities, and I understand that the cost of living is higher, but also like you can just make more money in cities where there's more money, you know, obviously. And but yeah, I mean, I think that I think rates are so tricky because I don't think that they actually tell you a lot about how much somebody is
Mhm.
making, you know, because you don't know how much they're working, you don't know like what their clientele is like or anything. But I do think that there are like white I mean, I don't want to like dance around this women who are white can make have higher rates than POC. You know, thin women can charge high. You know, I've done a lot of interviewing of BBW women because I get classified as BBW, and when I did that, a lot of the BBW women told me, and I actually haven't had this problem, and I think maybe this is also because I'm kind of in between, and that's also like a marker of privilege. But
Yeah.
I think that a lot of the people that I interviewed said that they had clients who told them that their rates shouldn't be as high because they were fat.
Whoa, wow.
Yeah, and
What?
that I heard that story many times from people that I interviewed. So it wasn't just like one shitty client; it was like a thing that happens like fairly regularly. And I've heard Black women say the same thing. I think that I've heard tattooed women say that as well, which I think is interesting. I know there is like people who really are into alt women, and who
The
that's
market
like a
for
thing that
that.
they like. But I've also heard a lot of people say, and this I don't know because I haven't had anybody um, give me a hard time about tattoos, but I have heard people say like, oh, that they've had people say you could make more money if you don't have any tattoos, and that rates are higher for pure whatever. That's so bizarre, right? Like you're
Oh my
actually
god.
a whore and you're
You should be
like,
pure.
but are you a pure whore or
What degree of horror are you?
right? Yeah. So I mean, I think and people with more experience, but also I think it's a matter of like what kind of capital you have access to. So I think that, can
Mhm.
do you have credit cards in which you can like book nice hotel rooms for your in calls with? Do you have like the right sort of like
Mhm.
clothes and shoes that transmit like this idea of like luxury? I think that there's so many
Luxury,
different
yeah.
things, and level of education and all that stuff. Those are very non-tangible things, but I think that they're cultural capital markers that we know how to pick up on that impact things like rates. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Like it's it's a really tricky conversation to have because like also I was speaking with Yana Petrov, who's also another companion here based in Vancouver,
Hmm.
actually, but like speaking in terms of like agency work and
Hmm.
independence.
Yeah.
Do you think they're like what about that kind of privilege too?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that much about agency work, I have to say. Like,
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
there
that's
it
okay.
doesn't really exist in my area.
Oh,
Yeah,
interesting.
like, or at least if it does, I don't know about it.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think that that's more of a thing like in Canada because you guys have like a Nordic model too, and we're just full
Mhm.
criminalization. So, um, but I do know that there are people who've worked for agencies in the US too. So, but
Mm.
I mean, if you're working for a agency, you obviously have somebody who's taking a cut. So that is a
Yeah.
totally different model. So
It's
I actually
completely
can't really
different.
speak to that because I've only
That's
worked
okay.
independently. Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. Like, I'll have to pick I'll have to
Yeah.
get someone on to speak about that in more detail too.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned some interesting things as well. I will say interesting. I'm not trying to say interesting so much. One of my listeners said that. I'm like, I know, I'm aware of it. Sorry. You mentioned even just like geographically,
Hmm.
like being bi-coastal is one thing just here in North America, and the same thing can kind of go in Canada where I'm from. So Vancouver would be higher rates.
Right.
Also, Toronto would be higher rates. But if you go to like the Maritimes or like the Prairie provinces, which is like the equivalent of your flyover states,
Right.
like
Yeah.
it's not going to be quite the same. And
Right.
even as I'm talking about more of like a global scale, talking about North America versus other parts of the world versus say Europe or versus parts of Asia where like sex work is super underground.
Right.
North Americans are put on a pedestal.
Mhm. Mhm.
Do you have any
Yeah.
thoughts about that?
I can only really speak to my like experience having like, as a US citizen. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that we had on the Horizon on my podcast, we recently had Maya Morena on, who's an undocumented sex worker. And she's like
Oh,
really interesting because she can talk a lot about like what it's like to even be here, but be like undocumented and not be able to have access to a bank account or other sorts of things that impact how you can do work. And if you don't have access to a bank account, you can't take deposits. And there's there's like a ripple effect to all of these things that I think make those things more complicated. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's um if you have access to the internet, if you
Mhm.
can advertise, if you can screen, if I- yeah, I mean, I think all of those things have like impact.
Yeah.
Yeah. Us.
Absolutely. Like, I know, like, I was speaking with another guest, one of my repeat guests, actually, Salome Salvi from the Philippines, and
Mm-hmm.
they have like a cyber sex law there where like sex work is not allowed. Like, you can't have an OnlyFans. There's like two or
Yeah.
three people in the country that have an OnlyFans, but they've like worked through this like loophole that like
Wow.
that
Yeah.
that allows them to do that, and like it's really tricky in that way, and like they've been trying to like make their way over here, but then that also comes with like a lot of different hoops that you have to go through.
Right.
Yeah. And like that, and like also I did some research earlier in the year, and I wanted to do an episode on this, but I just don't have I just don't have time to do it.
Yeah.
But I did an episode. I did some research with some youth sex workers, a lot from African
Oh,
countries.
wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and what sex work looks like over there, and just talking about police corruption and
Mm-hmm.
bribes,
Yeah.
and that whole aspect that like us here in North America, like we never maybe get to speak about or even discuss, like
Yeah. I mean,
in
I
that.
don't want to suggest that like there's not a lot of police corruption in the United States
Yeah.
that target sex workers and black trans sex workers, like, the most out of everybody. But like,
Mhm.
so we do have that, but yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter maybe of scale. And
Mhm.
yeah.
Absolutely. I know like a big topic on Twitter was the topic of being face out or
Hmm.
face
Yeah.
in. Yeah, like, and I know you have experience with this as well, but like what are your takes on this whole topic, cuz this was like really spicy in the thread.
It
So,
was really what?
it was really spicy.
Yeah, yeah, I mean,
Really
everything in sex
spicy.
work is spicy. That's why I was a little bit, like,
Yeah.
afraid to talk about this stuff, but, we
Yeah.
should have these conversations. So,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of reasons there's a lot of reasons to not be face out, and there's a lot of reasons to be face out, and I think that, I personally, like, respect all sex workers, like, choices that they make, because I feel like we all are forced to make, like, really difficult choices. And
Yeah.
the only reason and I had this experience in which I'm, like, both face out and not face out, like, depending on what I'm doing. And I think, like, in um the bigger reasons for me, like, not to be face out when I'm like advertising full service, for example, is that, like, I know for a fact that there's a lot of facial recognition software that's being developed for the police, and that, like, and a lot of this comes out of Pittsburgh, actually, out of, like,
Oh.
schools that were out of Carnegie Mellon was doing a lot of research on this, and a company was developed out of Carnegie Mellon called Marinus Analytic, and they're just one of many. And what they do is they develop facial recognition software that they sold to police departments, and the
Oh.
all of the, like, test things that they were using it for, they were scraping escort ads. So,
What?
and they were scraping escort ads, and they were lining escort pictures up to their real name social media. So once you have all
Holy
those,
crap.
like, facial points, data
Yeah.
points, they were mapping those on, and then they were connecting up, like, escort profiles to their real name profiles,
Oh my
and
gosh.
selling that information to the police. So I think that there's a lot of discussion about, like, whether or not you can get clients when you're not face out, and so do you
Mhm.
feel like you have to be face out in order for clients to want to book you? I haven't really had that problem, but I also have, like, a very different experience that I recognize, which is that, like, I built up a following before I went into full service. So now, like, some of, the people who come to me, like, as Jessie, and say, like, hey, I get the impression from your writing that you do this kind of work. Like, can we get together? And I'll be like, sure. Like, and I'll still follow all the same protocols. But even when just from ads where people don't know that I am who I am, like, I think um it's hard to say. I mean, maybe I don't get some inquiries that I would get if I was face out, but who knows? Like, I have no way of knowing what I'm not getting.
Yeah.
But but I do think that, like, there are a lot of sex workers who are successful who aren't face out, and that you can be successful and not be face out and figure out ways to creatively or seductively advertise your services. Um,
Yeah.
but I think that to say that sex workers who are face out, I'm not exactly sure. I didn't follow everything on the thread, like what people were arguing on the thread, but I think
Yeah.
to assume that like sex workers who are either face out or who are not face out are more privileged than other ones. I think that there's so many factors that go into that, and we never really know like why people are making the decisions that they're making. So I don't think that I just don't think anything is that simple. I don't think that we can say
No.
like, "Oh, well you have the privilege to be." I mean, here's what I can say, and I do think this is fair. Um
Hmm.
White educated indoor sex workers are not targeted by the police in the same way that trans people of color are. That's just
Yeah.
true. And so like
That.
that's a fact. So
Yeah.
I think that we can like unequivocally say like if you're a white woman living in suburbia and you could pass as like a Stepford wife and you put up your ads and you can do it face out being reasonably assured that you're not going to be targeted. So there's obviously
Mhm.
that. um
Yeah. Yeah. No kidding.
but I think that it's just more complicated than that because we don't know like who needs to keep their identity from like hostile exes who will fight for or for custody, like who has other sorts of legal issues or family issues or yeah, I don't know. I just think that um I don't know that I think maybe we can say that it's more um that if you're face out because you're not fearing police violence, that you obviously have a degree of privilege.
Of privilege.
Of
Yeah.
privilege,
No.
sure. But I also think that like it's just more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's not as simple as you mentioned. Like it was really an interesting discussion to have, like especially on the Twitter thread that really just opened my eyes because I always thought, like for me, I'll be honest, like and again, I'm constantly learning
Yeah.
at all times. Like for me, I always thought, okay, like you're being faced out, that is privilege. And then
Yeah.
we had like a lot of people come back to me like, that's not privilege. Sometimes they don't have the choice
Right.
to like, be face in, and like I have to be out, and like
Right.
that I never asked for that decision. So
Right.
like a lot of it, then the question and the conversation then went to, well, what choices do we have?
Right.
And that would
Mhm.
kind of dictate the amount or the degree of privilege that you exercise.
Right.
So
And I don't
yeah.
necessarily think that being like face out gives you more privilege. Like we can also talk about the privilege of like privacy that like a
Yeah.
lot of people just don't have. And I think that the conversation, I mean, I really feel like Thought Scholar, I don't know if you follow her, but on Twitter, the handle's Thought Scholar. They go by Moses Moon. Yeah, but they've done a lot of really interesting writing on like the dichotomy of this idea of privilege of like in-person and not in-person work. And one of these ideas, and I think this kind of maps onto this like face out or face in too, is I mean, she talked a lot about the fact that a lot of people were like, oh, well, if you're, working online, you're so much more privileged. But actually, like, that's also not that simple because you have so much more exposure, when
Yeah.
you're face
Yeah.
out. So
So much.
so you also like have more scrutiny. You're face
Yeah.
out, you have more scrutiny, you're doing like online work, you have way more exposure, you're at greater risk in that regard, in the sense that more people
Mhm.
see you. I mean, if you're not face out and you're doing most of your work, most of your screening and everything online and you're meeting like, and you have low volume clientele, you're probably like, the rest of your life is probably not going to be as impacted as if
Mhm.
you're like a cam girl that has 150,000
Like
followers, you know?
followers. Yeah,
You know, and
totally.
I think that it's just not that and I keep saying the same thing over and over again, but I think it's just not that simple. And I appreciate the work that like Moses Moon has done to talk about like why these
Mhm.
dichotomies of like privileged, not privileged,
Yes.
are like really flatten and simplify something that is actually more complicated than that.
It's very complicated. And like that's actually a really interesting take too. Interesting.
I'm like
Not
complicated and
good.
you're like interesting. You're like, that's interesting. And I keep saying that's complicated. And both of us need new words.
We do. I seriously need your work. Like you were mentioning like virtual work versus in-person work. And like
Mhm.
I guess it kind of goes into the next kind of bucket too, in terms of like contact versus non-contact work, and that whole idea of the hierarchy in that sense,
Mhm.
because there's a lot of privilege in that for sure. So I don't know if you want to speak a little bit about the hierarchy and the different types of hierarchies
Yeah,
that there
yeah.
are out there.
Um, yeah, I mean, one of the the hierarchy is this idea that like some sex workers are like at the top of the hierarchy and other ones are lower in terms of like status and social status, social capital. And usually when I've seen this laid out, I've seen like at the top being people who have less contact with clients, and at the bottom, greater contact, greater like physical risk. So often it looks like phone sex operators maybe at the top, and cam girls, and porn performers, and then strippers, and then escorts, and but
Like
I
street workers,
yeah,
yeah,
street workers below like indoor escorts. And I think that and people mix those up a little bit depending on like
yeah,
how what they even consider sex work to be, and all of
yes.
these like complicated things. But I don't know. I have to say, as somebody who's done probably most things except for stripping, because I don't have your kind of skills. I haven't done that. But I've done phone sex, I've done porn, I've done camming, I've done in-person work, I've done some dom work. And I think that in turn like I I feel like there's more like there's certainly more. I'm taking a step back because I'm trying to think of how to say this. Like there's this idea that you're more privileged if you're doing work like cam work than you are if you're doing full contact work or full service work. And I think for a lot of people, that's probably true. There's certainly like less issues of physical safety and things like that. But there is also, I have found that working online is like a much more difficult, constant hustle than it is
Yes.
to do like in person
Yes.
stuff. And
I
not
agree.
only that, but I feel like it depends on what we mean by privilege, because also you have way more people who are like trying to get a piece of you all the time 24/7. It's harder
Mhm.
to enforce boundaries because this so like online space gives people the impression that you're like always available. I think that to be an online sex worker means that you're having to carry like a much bigger volume of clients and fans for much smaller amounts of money, $5. If
Yeah.
you're being a
Yeah.
cam girl, tokens, 5-cent tokens,
Yeah.
like
5 cents.
that's how much a
Yeah.
token is worth, you know?
Exactly.
How many tokens do you need to do to get like what you can get for an hour of one client bringing like an hour rate to you if you're working in person? So I think
Right.
that and also, and I've heard a lot of people who've done both things talk about the fact that like um the boundaries are harder to maintain with in person with online sex
Online?
clients, and
Yeah.
also what they're asking for is often like a lot
Yeah.
more invasive, and that's like kind of counterintuitive, because you think if somebody wants to meet you in person and you know have relations with you, that they're
Mhm.
asking more, but like I've actually found that it's a little bit more straightforward than like these online interactions where what they want is like a
Yeah.
whole lot of attention, like
Yeah, I
over
agree.
long periods of time. So,
Yes.
you know, I think
I can
that
see that.
yeah, I mean, I just think that thinking about this, as these and not only that, but like the chance of like your uncle and your mom and like your
Yeah.
sister seeing what you're doing when you're doing like full service work or working in a club or something is so much less than if you're broadcasting every single day for hours and hours and hours. So I just think that the risks are different, and that's why I like the work. That I think there's risks in all forms of sex work, but I think that the risks are different types of risks, and it depends on like what you're doing. I mean, one of the things that I talked a lot to Moses Moon about, where she kind of shaped my thinking about this, was, if we're going to talk about why it's safer to do like your work from home, like we're not taking into consideration what about people in domestic violence situations? What about people with controlling partners?
Yeah.
Who
Yeah.
now you're trying to run a sex work business as a cam girl or as whatever you're doing with like abusive partner sitting right
Yeah.
next to you, and so
There's
I
someone hovering. Yeah.
yeah, there's just a
It's
lot of
tricky.
different ways in which these conversations get flattened. And one of the interesting things I found is that prior to the pandemic, just in observing what happens on Twitter,
Mhm.
this is my observation, obviously, but like one of the things I saw is that like in person, a lot of in person full service sex workers and DOMs would talk about like um, you know, how the work that they did was, so much more involved or had carried so much more risks or all sorts of things that like I understand where they're coming from. And I also do that sort of work. So I get it. Then
Right.
the people who were doing online sex work and online sex workers were often like, are they even really sex workers? And when the pandemic hit and so
Mm.
many people got pushed to doing online sex work, I saw that rhetoric change a little bit. Like, yeah, like, wait, you guys, what? How do you all make a living like this? Like, yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. And I even had like a lot of people who like I had interviewed before who'd come on Peep Show who had only done full service or only done in person work prior to the pandemic, who would say like that they decided to stop for whatever reason during the pandemic, or for health reasons during the pandemic, and do only
Yeah.
online content, and say like this online thing is draining, like there's no downtime from
It
it,
is.
it's really difficult. So you know and I mean,
Yeah.
maybe that's something you can talk about too, like who stopped
Yeah.
working during the pandemic. That's also a question of privilege, but
Totally. Yeah, 'cause I know people that did for, yeah, as you mentioned, like, health reasons, to protect themselves, and then there was also people that just kept going with their in person, but there was a lot of people who pivoted and shifted and just started doing online and maybe just stayed doing
right,
online as
yeah,
well.
because it's also a
Yeah.
matter of like I really think that I think that the hierarchy ought to be like dismantled. I think it's kind of
Yes.
ridiculous.
It's so detrimental.
It's detrimental, it's ridiculous, and it sets up sex workers to be like at like to think of each other as like enemies instead of like banding
Yeah.
together to look at how, I mean, I think that when Fosta Sesta hit, for example, like so many full
Mhm.
service sex workers were like, yeah, we're coming for you next, or they're coming for you next if you're not going to stand up, for all of the people who were doing online sex work who were like, well, that's not me. You know, then we had like Pornhub kick everybody off, and
Yeah,
OnlyFans claim that they were going to do the
the
same
whole
thing, and
thing.
payment processors shutting down. And so, like, really,
Exactly.
what we need to be doing is like banding together. And if we're like separating up
100%.
everybody and deciding like who's legitimate sex workers and whose problems are bigger than other people's problems, I think that um, isn't super useful.
No.
On the other hand, I do think that we ought to recognize that there are just like that some people are privileged over other ones, and for that reason, I kind of think that we should. I don't know. I'm saying this and I'm like embarrassed saying this because like, why am I talking about this? I kind of feel
Mm.
like we should. create space for people who are more marginalized to like come up in the
Yeah.
conversation. So yeah.
Yeah, and like the fact that we even have to say that is like I understand the embarrassment because just like this should just be common sense. Like to me, it just makes sense to include everybody. But like as you mentioned, with the hierarchy, it just separates all of us and pits us against
Right.
each other and makes us all really really competitive. And I
Right.
don't
And
really
also
think
like
that it's needed.
all forms of sex work are work, and all forms are have their own sets of like challenges and risks, and part of it is just like what your like risk tolerance is and what your personality is. Like I was good at phone sex and I'm good at in person because I like the sort of like interpersonal stuff, and I was a terrible cam girl because I do not like entertaining a crowd, and I would be a terrible dancer for the same reason. And I think that like I think it's a lot of like to talk about it as if it's not just also like where your skills are, and what you
Mm,
like doing better and what your personality is, and are you a entertainer, or are you like a do you like the one-on-one interactions,
yeah.
do you want to you know do you like physical like touch, or do you want to be able to serve your clients without any touch? I mean, I think that all of that is also just a matter of preference that we shouldn't be putting on the on a hierarchy.
Yeah, no, that's really, really great. And I'm so glad we talked about that and brought that up into conversation. This conversation, I know one person said, like, oh, to be talking about privilege, you're really brave. Good luck.
I
Good
know.
luck.
This might we might just be like canceled after this. I don't know.
I know. But I hope that we had brought up some really good points and like we were able to hopefully display both sides and both like different perspectives. And after Jessie, I'll let you go. Not quite yet, but soon. I will be reading out some things that people what people decided what they think
Hmm.
privilege is or what their own definition of privilege, what they think is privilege in sex work.
Yeah,
And then at the very end of the show, I'm going to have some different voice memos from actual
that's
sex
nice.
workers
Yeah.
to share their stories. So yeah, but like, is there anything else that you want to talk about? Like, what are some closing notes here? I think like, well, privilege to us or to me, my takeaways are like, there's privilege in varying degrees. It really depends on people's situations because it's not just one blanket
Yeah.
thing. And as you said, it can't be so simplified, right?
Right.
So
I also think that like
yeah,
intersectionality is important to recognize, because you can't just
absolutely.
you can't just say like, oh, well, thin workers make more money than fat workers, and white workers make more money than black workers, and because all of these things
Right.
like interact with they there's like overlapping oppressions that I think need to be recognized because they change the shape of somebody's experience. And so yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, for that reason, like that's what I was saying. Like, I'm kind of uncomfortable like talking about like how I can compare my experience to somebody else's experience, because I don't think that I necessarily can. And we all come to this work for like very different reasons.
Reasons.
And
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that we didn't talk about that I think is important to say is that like a lot of sex workers are in sex work because they may have disabilities, or they may be caretakers
Mhm.
to people with disabilities, or
Yeah.
they may be parents that just like have to be home with their kids because their kids have special needs, or there's all sorts of reasons that people come into it, and we don't know what those reasons are. And
No.
so I think it's really easy to like get on Twitter and say, oh, well, she shouldn't be talking because she's privileged, when you or all sorts of things like
Yeah.
Twitter, sex work Twitter can be kind of a hostile place.
It can be. Yes, it can be.
Um, but we don't know how much we don't actually we assume a lot of things about people
We do.
and that we don't know. um
Yeah, and we just don't know what kind of situations people are in, where their mental state is, what they're emotionally thinking and stuff too.
yeah.
It's all the invisible things that we one don't talk enough about,
Hmm.
and two, like it's really like it's hard to say or put everyone in a box and be like,
Right.
well, privilege and not privilege. You know what I mean?
Right. It's just, yeah, you just can't do that because there's all sorts of factors that go in. And we can't, one of the things about sex work, one of the reasons that sex work is so diverse and that there's all these different types of sex work and all these different types of sex workers is because sex work is an industry that has a low barrier to entry, that like the wages are high for the amount of hours that you work, by and large, like in comparison to other feminized labor. That you can do from wherever you are, that you don't need a boss to do. So there's all sorts of reasons why people who, um, are pushed out of conventional employment, like end up in the sex industry. And we ought to, I think we ought to think of that as like a strength and recognize that most of the people that are in sex work are probably there um, because that fits for them better than other
Yeah.
forms of employment, and that
There's
should be good
conventional
enough
work.
reason.
Yeah, and the fact that shouldn't even be asking people why they're
Right.
going to get sex work. Like that shouldn't even be a question. Do we ask like my sister why she wants to work a certain job, or like
Right.
my boss? Like we don't ask that stuff. Like we don't have to ask that stuff.
Yeah.
And we need to stop like asking people for like this kind of validation. It's
Yeah.
really, really dangerous.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, but this conversation was really enlightening, and I'm so glad to have invited you back on to speak about this. Like you're such a great resource, and everyone who is listening who is curious about Jessie's other episode on the podcast, it's episode 71. So be sure to peep that and peep her peep show podcast as well and on Horizon. That was great.
That was good, yeah.
It was super good. But there is more on the episode, so I'm going to continue the episode. I'm going to let Jessie go because I know she has a lot of stuff to do today. But Jessie, where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter at sapiotextual, and I have a website, jessiesage.com, and peepshowmagazine.com you can check out. And on the Horizon, that's WHOR, like Whoreizon. So you can find that anywhere you can find podcasts.
Wonderful. Awesome. Well, everyone else, stay listening, stay on here because it's going to be more on the episode. But Jessie, thank you so much for joining me today. All right. Thanks so much for tuning in and staying with me. We have so much to go through. And I really wanted to kind of shout everyone out as well. Some people have requested to have their names and their handles attached with their comments because basically I had asked on Twitter, like, what does privilege mean to you? What is privilege in sex work? And have people define it themselves. So I'm just going to kind of go through the list. There's quite a bit here. So I'm going to try to do my best and then stick to the end because there's going to be much more. So yes, the question was, what does privilege mean to you? What does privilege in sex work mean to you? And Narcissist by Nature mentioned the fact that you don't get hard labor and you are gifted with a sexy, marketable body is the privilege. Jay Sneaks mentioned, I think thin privilege can be a thing in sex work. Yes, as we mentioned on the show today. Body by Blunts mentioned rates and screening, which we also mentioned. Rosy Skies mentioned being conventionally attractive, which is another big one. We have Lovetron, the privilege to be able to have good, reliable equipment and sex toys. The privilege to be able to do it inside over the internet. Bellatrix Sweets mentioned having other options, family support, being white, thin, conventionally attractive. Simplicity Dad Serena mentioned also, I think it's important to differentiate privilege from basic rights. Yes, we didn't really get to go into that. The person also mentioned doing any kind of preparation for sex work as opposed to being thrown in due to circumstances. Yes. Receiving adequate mental and general health services. Choosing what kind of work you don't want to do because of enough financial security. Big one. Pretty Epitome mentioned being face out, as we talked in the show. HHNANHH, being able to pick and choose your clients, set higher prices, being cis and white. These are all great things that we have discussed in the show, have we mentioned here as well, and also just really hard to ignore. So thank you everyone for contributing all of that. I really wanted to make sure that we spoke about that because there was just so much that came in. And now for the last segment of the show, I know we usually do some Q&A and stuff, but I decided to kind of switch it up this time around. So there was so much of an uproar on Twitter that I really wanted to include everyone's stories and include their real voices as well. So we have some stories here, some voice memos from a varying amount of sex workers in the Twitter sphere that really want to kind of pitch in their opinion on what their experience with privilege is, or how privilege has affected them, or maybe it hasn't affected them. All these stories, which are super, super intimate, so raw, and thank you for the few that have contributed. I'll be playing them in shortly. Stay tuned. We're going to start off with actually a written submission from one of the sex workers on Twitter. So I wanted to shout out, she also wanted to use her name as well, ERP God. But again, the question was, how do you see privilege in the sex work community? So it's a little bit long, so bear with me. I have an odd relationship with my position as a sex worker. I absolutely love my job. I feel so free to be myself. I feel like I excel creatively and I can be the healthiest version of myself. But I feel free to do so because I can do my job behind a screen. I do not have to be touched. I barely have to be seen. As a virtual sex worker, I feel I do have privileges that other sex workers don't. Yet, at the same time, who am I to decide that? My kinks with VR, virtual reality, are very real. And if a sex worker who does more in real life work enjoys that, then that is valid too. I feel like I've adapted to loving sex work, but I also recognize that I've adapted to sex work within a society that frowns upon sex work. Do I frown upon sex work? No, I love it. So did sex work ever truly make me feel bad, or did I just feel bad about it because society taught me that it's something to feel bad about? I've done a lot of things in my life, and I've had a lot of different jobs throughout my lifetime. From working on cars to working in a laboratory, I'm well-rounded in employment experience. But I've never made as much at any of those jobs. I've never felt as safe and secure financially as I do when I'm simply being my sexual self to entertain others. I enjoy it because I feel like I get to be more myself than I ever have anywhere. Yet in the same breath, I also feel disheartened that my skills have never been worth as much within anything else. Even when I was working in a lab, which to me seems of much importance, I couldn't envision the kind of security that I feel being a sex worker. I feel like deciding if this was truly my choice or not is a very complex question to answer. But what can I say is that I'm happy doing it and has brought about a lot of interest in my life to study sexuality and work to try to help others with theirs. I'd like to be a sex therapist in the future and utilize VR as a telehealth option for people who feel like that works best for them as a communication tool. I don't want to make being a sex worker a case of having to throw my dreams of academia away and having to choose between the two. Instead, I want to combine them. Working in sex work is giving me the privilege of going back to school so I can obtain the proper credentials to try to effectively help people in the future. It is not a dream that I would see as viable without it. With the use of technology and the internet, I am able to create sexually stimulating content by using visual art and sound. I do enjoy incorporating my body into that, but it's something that I can do at my leisure, and it's not really required of me. For me, this makes it easier to survive as a sex worker living with disabilities, chronic illness, and pain. Anecdotally, I find that a lot of my friends who are also sex workers are also disabled, chronically ill, or experience chronic pain. It's not just exclusive to just sex workers though, but throughout online content creation generally. I feel like that is a complex situation that is hard for me to touch base on without my head going in a million different directions. But I think it's important to think about. Why is that? We are living in a time where people can stay at home, broadcast their skills, using their body to some degree for hundreds, for thousands, maybe even millions of people a month to see. For so many people, that way of life seems more appealing than going out and working in social situations. I feel that we are very privileged to have the tools to make that a reality. They are choices that have not always been available, and I am sure that during those times, questioning whether sex work was a choice was far more mentally taxing. I feel blessed that I can express my sexuality. do my homework, all within the same space of how far technology has come. I also feel blessed in getting to choose my own schedule, and I have a lot of control in how much energy I put into situations. If someone makes me feel unsafe or overwhelmed, I can instantly block them and they are gone. That makes me feel privileged in that I can prioritize being safe over being nice. I am really no one to say whether my position in sex work is better or worse than anyone else's. All I can really identify is that I am happy and that I feel safe. I think that is important, and I think is what we all hope to achieve through doing whatever work we choose to do so in the long run. I think we all want to feel like we are surviving in a secure way that isn't causing us a degree of stress and makes us feel burnt out or like we are dying. I believe that being able to achieve that is a necessity for our survival. I now want to share a voice memo from Adora Bautista on Twitter, and here goes.
This is Adora Bautista talking about my experiences with privilege and sex work. I've been a sex worker for over 10 years now. I started with stripping and have done a lot of different sorts of types of sex work, including camming, phone sex, full service. I've been pretty privileged in my line of work. I don't feel like it was a last resort measure. However, there have been times, I would say for most of my career, that I've struggled very badly, have feeling taken advantage of. But on the whole, I'm grateful for the experiences that sex work has given me. One thing that's interesting to deal with, especially as an online content creator, is that of fetishization in my race and ethnicity. Technically, I'm multiracial. I am half white and half Asian, and I feel the pressure in order to stand out to fetishize my Asian side, and it makes me very uncomfortable, especially since I have a lot of fans and followers who obviously seek out my content because of that. However, I don't think that my race detriments my work. Unlike perceptions of other races, I don't feel like I have to pretend to be white, for example, to fully white, to make good money online. At worst, it's just that the fetishization of my race and ethnicity make me feel uncomfortable. I don't consider myself a face-out sex worker. However, I do produce some content that does show my face. For example, on my OnlyFans and other VIP subscriptions, I will upload some pictures in quick videos that do show my face. Or sometimes I will upload clips that show my face. And then for especially custom pictures, people can pay $20 to see a picture of my face. However, I don't share photos or videos of my face publicly. There's been discourse on whether or not being faced out is a privilege. Some people say that a privilege is something you can't change, that you can't control. For example, you can't control how old you are, what your race is, but you can choose whether or not to show your face or not. I do consider being faced out a privilege, though, and there are many reasons for why I say this, but coming from a pretty conservative culture, I'm not talking about living in the United States, but from the Asian side of my family, it would be very looked down upon within my family if they found out I was a sex worker. I don't know if I would be disowned or what. When I lied to my parents about working as a waitress in a strip club, they threatened to disown me. And I can only imagine that the reactions would be worse if they found out what I actually did and what I've done since, what I'm doing now. I don't feel comfortable within my family, within the greater world, exposing who I actually am, what I do for work. I do think I could make more money if I was faced out, if the people in my personal life knew what I did. But money isn't everything. I can't see myself being happy, being disowned by my family in order to make a lot of money by being faced out. I'm currently pregnant, due to give birth in the next month, and it's been worrying, not just because this is an unexpected pregnancy, but I'm planning to go about it as a single mother. And in a way, you could say that sex work is good for this. For example, it would probably be pretty hard to hold down a traditional job with a more rigid schedule. It'd be hard to hold down it'd be hard to hold down a normal job with a more rigid schedule when you're caring for a child on your own. But with sex work, I can change around my schedule the way I want to make money and take care of my child. For example, I went on tour for the past couple of months to save up a lot of money. I can choose a few hours a week to do cam shows and the like. I can schedule a few hours at a time to not just create content, but upload content to my OnlyFans, schedule it out weeks or even months in advance, make money off of that. Nevertheless, I still see being a single mother and a sex worker as a hard path to go down. For example, while I mentioned that you can schedule posts on OnlyFans, there are a lot of other platforms that don't allow you to schedule out your posts. I mostly gain my OnlyFans subscribers by using the site Tryst, which is mainly for in-person providers. However, I get my most subscribers when I go on tours because I my profile shows up in more locations, but because I won't be able to tour for a while, I can only really set my location to my home location, which means my profile is going to get fewer views, hence fewer people to subscribe to my OnlyFans. I wouldn't be surprised if my subscriber count drops by more than 50% by February. I would love to do some touring again. In the past few months, I visited cities like Chicago and Anaheim, California, and it was very lucrative. However, as a single mother, how am I supposed to go on tour again? Then there are escort ad sites that don't allow you to advertise online services at all. With Tryst, I mentioned how they allow you to post your OnlyFans links, and they have a section where you can post prices and descriptions for virtual services, but other sites are very strict about not allowing you to post about online services. How am I supposed to advertise my virtual services in the adult platforms I'm on if I can't use mainstream social media sites like Facebook or Instagram? I think all of my adult Twitter profiles are shadow banned. Not to mention on sites like Reddit and Twitter, a lot of those people are just freeloaders, versus on Tryst, a lot of the people who are roaming through profiles are more than willing to spend money, which I'm pretty sure you can find on a lot of escorting sites. And if some of those escorting sites don't allow us to promote our virtual services, then single mothers like me are just kind of left in the dust when we can no longer do in-person work.
Hi there. I've been asked to just voice some of my concerns and some of my experiences being a face out, using my real name provider. I'm also a white provider, so I know my privilege as being a white provider. I don't look at my face being out as being a privilege. Being in the industry for many, many years, being face out really takes away all of your privacy. You know, I'm catcalled in airports, I'm catcalled in malls, I'm catcalled in stores, I'm approached in stores, I'm approached when I'm with my children. I think that when you have children, it's important to keep them safe. If you don't want to have that uncomfortable conversation with them regarding sex work and that you are a sex worker, then being face out is probably not an option for you. Because your kids will find out eventually, and they need to find out from you, not from their friends who have seen your ads on social media or on Twitter. That is one of the reasons why I use my real name and I'm face out, is because I've had people come up to me when I'm with my children using my fake name, and it's inappropriate and unhealthy and goes against all of the boundaries. Like, heaven forbid if we were to walk up to a client when he's with his family, correct? But for some reason, it seems like the boundaries lack on our side when it comes to our safety and our boundaries and our children and keeping our kids safe. So for me, being face out is also, if you think about it, I've got 14,000 followers on Twitter. I don't know what they look like, but they know what I look like. So sometimes it's scary. It's scary being in a crowd of people, knowing that at least 10 of those people know who you are, but you don't know who they are. So sometimes there's a fear factor involved as well. Stigma, society, social media, all of that makes it very difficult to be a face out worker now. I regret it. If I could do it again, I would not have my face out, but I am so well known at this point, and it's not even an option to rebrand at this point. So I just continue to be face out. I have the uncomfortable conversations with my children, and I carry on with my days. But, advice to other sex workers, I would probably not be face out today. Have a great day. And I'd like to add also that as I became more popular on Twitter and social media sites is when it became more uncomfortable. Thank you.
And lastly, we have Ellie Fox, who will be sharing a little bit about their experience as well.
Hi, Sia. Thanks for having me. Just wanted to start by saying that I loved the lecture that you gave for FSU, and now I'm legit gonna binge listen to your entire podcast. Also, your lecture is ironically a great entry point into what you wanted to discuss, which was privilege. The people that you were lecturing were probably all somewhere, between the ages of 18 and 24. I would say, and probably through privilege, education, tuition, and circumstance, they all got a front row seat to your vast repertoire of experiences and got not only to ask you questions, but to have you directly answer them. And that right there, I think, is privilege. And from my own point of view, if you may, I'm kind of like you in that I got into sex work after my mid-20s, which is considered late in sex work years because everybody gets in at like 18. But by the time that I got in, which was I want to say like 27 or something like that, or maybe later, I don't remember very much. It was like 2017. I had already graduated college. I had a full-blown career in risk management. I had money. I lived in South Beach, which was teeming with escorting demand, sex work demand. And the privilege that got me all those things is the same privilege that allowed me the choice to drop all of it, get into escorting, and set higher and higher hourly rates the more I learned the ropes. I mean, that's not to say that I had a smooth ride. There's a learning curve. I think there's a learning curve that we all go through as sex workers. I had a seeking arrangement phase too, and was like, nope, not for me. I found out the hard way that the amount of emotional labor that some of those guys on those sites require is out of fucking control. Also, I had to learn the racial politics of sex work in my particular location in Miami. There are these like sketchy as hell quote unquote agencies that target newbies depending on their race and ethnicity. When I started out back in 2017, one or two of these agencies tried to recruit me, working 8 to 9 hours a day, 6 hours a week with like a super minimal percentage of the hourly rate. And to top it all off, they wanted the girls to even do the agency's own bank deposits. It was like, I mean, the definition of exploitation and like illegal. But they target, like I noticed that they target Hispanic girls because when they messaged me in Spanish. And I didn't post anything in Spanish in any Spanish websites, or like back when Craigslist had their sex work friendly option. I never put anything in Spanish, but they contacted me in Spanish. So they're seeking out people that look like me. And I'm pretty sure that's because they assume that they're either undocumented, uneducated, or in desperate need. And then on the flip side, you can literally go on arrows. I don't know if you can put it on your podcast. You can edit that out, but you can go on arrows.com and search young educated European model and find a plethora of profiles with like no bio, no description, nothing but a picture of a 20-year-old girl and her height, weight, and measurements all in metric system. So obviously somebody that's not from the US. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but you know, when you look at a picture of a girl that on Arrows, which is like a very straightforward escorting website, and it's a picture of a 20-year-old girl that looks not just coy but hesitant. It makes you doubt a little bit, and then top that off with absolutely no description of her other than a picture. So there's flip sides to every privilege. There comes a downside, I would say. And I guess the point I was trying to make is with the young European models is that they're very much allowed to charge a lot more money than the Hispanic girls. If you look it up, the Hispanic girls can range from 200 to like 300 or 400 an hour, whereas the quote unquote European models charge from $600 to $1,000 an hour, and at the end of the day, you don't even know if all of that is going to her or an agency.
So many great responses here. I am so touched and so grateful to have been given the opportunity to speak to so many people that have reached out during that viral tweet, and I just wanted to say that I've recognized my own privilege in the sex work, and this episode really truly meant a lot to me and really shown a lot of things that I had never considered before. So thank you so much for listening. It's going to be new episodes every single Sunday. Don't forget to like, rate, share, and subscribe, and we'll catch you in for another episode next Sunday. Bye. You're listening to Strip by Sia, hosted, produced, and edited by Steph Sia, artwork by Maria Bellandarama, music by Ted D, and photography by Ian Dabburn.